Hello, everyone. I'm super excited to be here and to share my talk with you today. So the title of my talk is What If It All Started in Figma? And it's largely focused on design systems.
Hello, everyone.
And its composing parts. And in terms of the story I have to tell today, when I was younger, and just generally in my life, I was raised by three women, my mum, my auntie, and my grandma. And I call those three women the three wonder women of my life. And these are the women that helped create the space for me to play as a child, to develop and to thrive. And that was our shared space, our home. And since I was a kid, and just like a lot of children, I love to play. And for anyone that loves to play, being a designer, you can probably empathize with this. I love toys. And I loved my toys, and I took them everywhere. And in fact, this was a photo shoot to take a picture to send to my mum when she was away. And I had to take my toy with me. And every day after school, I would get home and I had this big box full of all of my toys, every single one. And I would open it up, I would take it to the living room, and I would flip it upside down and have them all over the floor. And I would play with it for hours, and I would tell stories. I would have the racing car driver make friends with the cheetah, and they would go on an adventure together. And this was joy. This was my life. It was as hard as it got, and I loved it. And this may hit a soft spot for some of the parents listening, but as soon as I was done playing with my toys, I wouldn't put them away. I'll just leave them there for my Wonder Women to clean up after me. And if you're a parent, hold your breath for the next slide. But this is roughly what you'd see if you came to my house. If you saw me after school playing with my toys, you'd see a scene like this. This isn't exactly my house. This isn't a picture of my living room as a child, but it's the closest I could find that resembled it. And in fact, that toy at the very middle, I love Monsters, Inc. I had the exact same toy, and I went to sleep with it every night. And our home was a shared space. It was a shared space between me and the Wonder Women in my life. And there was four of us living in that shared space, in this context, our living room. We had regular guests, and like I said, I had lots of toys. And a shared space is, and as soon as it involves people, is a complex space. And an organization, like any other shared space, is a complex space. Design systems within organizations as shared spaces, they're also equally complex. And to give you an idea of the organization I work for today, Zoopla are a UK-based company of roughly 600 people, with 200 of those people working in product and technology, 20 designers, and roughly 100 engineers. And it's a company that focuses on, or has two core parts to it. A consumer part, which is essentially a product ecosystem that allows consumers to find a home on the market to buy or rent in the UK, to see the estimated value of any home in the UK, to book a valuation of their home, find the right estate agent, amongst a few other things. It also has a customer part. And customers in the context of Zoopla are typically estate agents or property developers. And Zoopla's customers can benefit from a product ecosystem that allows them to list homes, to buy or to let on the market, to manage their active listings, to receive leads from consumers, amongst many other things. And being a designer, seeing that product ecosystem, I'm sure you can imagine the important role a design system can play in speeding teams up and making things as coherent and as consistent as possible. And I know many of you will be familiar with design systems and you will understand it in detail, but just so that we're all on the same page, a design system is essentially a set of user experience patterns and a component library that teams can use and reuse to build products and experiences. And I know this analogy gets used and overused, but you can think of design systems as essentially the collection of the Lego pieces that teams use to build ever more complex products to serve user needs. And if we run with that metaphor and we think about the Lego pieces as the code and the designs that can then be referenced via the tools, Figma being one of those tools, but you have other tools that you can reference a design systems components in. Those tools are then referenced by designers that can use those individual pieces to build ever complex front-end experiences that solve or address user needs. And if we put all of those together, a design component, a design piece will feed into what gets built in the coding side, and the coding side would feed back into what ends up happening in the design side. And as we've seen with some of the talks today and with Dylan's intro, there's a really great opportunity for that relationship between design and engineering and other parts of the business. But those end up working together and feeding back into the tools that can be referenced by others to create even more pieces that feed into even better front-end user experiences that an end user can experience. But underneath that, you have the processes that exist in the company, the culture, and more importantly, the people that feed upward into all of those. And I've seen another design system, or I've seen another iceberg shown in another talk today, but I like to think of it as a design systems iceberg. So you have the tip of the iceberg, which is what the end user gets to see, the front-end user experience. But underneath the surface, you have these beautifully complex things that help shape what happens above the surface. And if we go back to the shared space that I had as a child with the Wonder Women of my life, there was a dynamic where the Wonder Women would clean up after me, and I could just focus on the play, on the creating. And one of the Wonder Women, observing me after some time, she decided to sit down with me. And she approached the conversation in a really kind way. And I'll never forget this. And she sat me down and she said, I can see how much you love playing with your toys. I can see the joy that it brings you. And I don't want you to ever stop. But she then said, I've been meaning to ask you for some time. Why is it that when you play with your toys, when you're done, why don't you put them away? And naively, my answer was, well, I'm done playing with them. So it's done. And I wasn't sure where she was going with this. But then she followed by asking me, well, okay, if you're not going to put them away, who usually puts them away for you? And I said, well, you will, and my mom and my auntie. And at this point, some of the guilt started to creep in. And I still wasn't sure where she was going with this. But then the last question that she asked me was, so why do you think that we put them away for you? And from asking those very simple questions, she got me on my journey of introspection that has never ended. So thank you so much, Grandma. But she got me to think about the role that I played in the shared space that we had. I was the chaos to the order that they tried to introduce day after day after a hard day's work. And it really got me thinking. Went through a hard time as a kid and spent a lot of time staring at my toys in the distance. But eventually, I started to reflect. And this informed how I think today. And I love breaking things. And if you're a designer, you can probably empathize with this. Breaking things is fun. You can tear them apart, figure out how they work, try to piece them together, sometimes unsuccessfully, but also build bigger things and more impressive and better working things from those broken parts. But then it's what you do after breaking those things that matters. And what you leave behind for others, that's also important. And that's the thing that she got me to reflect on. And if we go back to that design systems iceberg, today in the design community, we'll find a number of resources. We'll find an ongoing conversation, many articles written about the Lego pieces, the tools that are used to reference those Lego pieces, to some degree, the processes that can be put in place to make that feed upwards even more efficient and allowed to create even better user experiences for those end users. But what I'd like to focus on today is the very bottom of the iceberg, the very start of every design system. And I believe that's the people. If we think about those individual constituent parts of a design system in the context of an organization like Zoopla, you can think of the Lego pieces in the form of code as largely React components, and the pieces in the form of designs exist largely in a Figma component library. And those can be referenced by the wider business in tools like Zero Height, but from an engineering perspective, they can also be referenced via tools like Storybook. And combined, they can be used by designers and teams to create amazing front-end user experiences. But we identified an opportunity. Going back to that base, the very start of the iceberg, Zoopla as an organization is growing, and we're doing a lot of recruiting, particularly in product and technology. And with that recruiting, we've been recruiting a lot of new designers. So we identified an opportunity to really think about how might we, from the very start, empower designers to, as easily as possible and as quickly as possible, use the design system to solve problems and build products. And normally when you join an organization, one of the ways to help you get started and to help you understand what you have at hand to be able to build and create and help evolve the organization, you might go through an onboarding. And we thought that might be a good place to start. Why don't we create an onboarding for our design system? And thus an onboarding was born. And our design system is called Blueprint. So if you see Blueprint, or if I say Blueprint from now on, I'm referring to Zoopla's design system. So we decided to create this onboarding, and we were thinking what might be a good place for this onboarding to start, particularly if we're starting with designers. Even though it doesn't end there, we can start with designers and move on from there. We thought it might be a good idea to use the tool that designers would already use to create designs. So Figma was a good choice. And we also thought, okay, the onboarding experience, joining a new business can be a bit overwhelming. You have so many new things to learn. You have so many documents to get through before you start to feel like you're useful and you're adding value to the organization, and you're trying to push back that imposter syndrome that's creeping all the time. And we didn't want to add to that pile. We didn't want to add to all of that theory that you have to get through before you can start to add value. So we decided to break it down into 4 different user types that might go through this onboarding. So the first one being a visitor, someone who would need to understand what Blueprint, our design system, is, know where to reference Blueprint. A user, someone who'd be able to import Blueprint components into their projects, replace existing components with different states, and suggest improvements to Blueprint. Contributors who'd be able to create new components, commit and revert changes, and lastly, maintainers who'd be able to correctly structure components, understand how to communicate changes, and publish library changes. So you can think of this flow as going from sort of light user to power user. And the stars seem to align for us with this, because at the same time as we were working in this, Figma happened to release their linking feature. So amazing. Not only could we have designers on board on the tool that they're going to use to create their designs, but we can link directly to the actual real libraries that we use to design products with. And they could very quickly start to understand and become familiar with those libraries. So it seemed like all the stars had aligned. So we set about our journey, and we built 3 onboarding journeys to begin with a 4th one eventually added on. And we wanted to go to the right level of detail to make sure that we capture the right level of theory, but also we wanted to introduce a little bit of practice. So as a designer joining Zoopla, going through the onboarding, you would be able to very quickly understand in your own time, whenever you feel is relevant, which screens that you need to design to for the native apps, for the web experiences, what do the live products look like today, and be able to very quickly access those designs directly in Figma, copy them and paste them onto your own team's workspaces, and play around and explore without the fear that you'll be creating chaos for other people in your shared space. But also, we wanted to create a playground. So we allowed designers from the very offset to try designing their first screen as easily as possible using real Blueprint components. And to do that, we allow them to easily add a button, to be able to add an icon, whilst being able to understand where things are stored, the structure of things, but also actually have an understanding of how to use some of our type stacks, change the colors of text, and understand which colors we have today are accessible. We actually embed the accessibility rating in the color itself. So some of these tools in the design system to make it as easy and as user-friendly as possible for a designer to onboard themselves on our design system. And just like any experience designed for an end user, we decided to test it. So we asked the designers who'd gone through the onboarding, designers who joined our organization recently, and designers who'd also might have not been too familiar with our design system blueprint. From a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not helpful at all, and 5 being very helpful, how helpful did you find the onboarding in Figma? And you can see here that out of 6 participants, the average score was 4. So many people found the onboarding helpful. The majority found the onboarding helpful. But just like any first version of anything, there is still a lot of room for improvement. And as the design system scales and as it evolves, and with all of the Figma announcements today and the updates that we may have to make, then there are always improvements that can be put in place on the onboarding experience itself. But you can also see that it's working extremely well for some of the other designers. And the good news is you're probably thinking, well, this is great, nice story, cool story, bro, but how am I going to find time to do this? Our design systems team is stacked. They're doing everything at the same time. I don't have any time. I can't create an onboarding experience. So the good news is we're making our onboarding template, our design system onboarding template, available to duplicate for free on the Figma community. So keep an eye out, follow me on Twitter, and follow us on the Figma community, and it'll be available soon. And we'd love to hear from you, how you find using this template, whether it's working for you, whether you broke it apart and found new ways of using it, and whether it's actually helping your teams to foster a greater design systems culture. And it doesn't have to stop at design. Though we started with design to test it, you can use an onboarding experience to build empathy. Could product owners go through an onboarding for the blueprint or for the design system? Could engineers go through a similar experience? It may not all have to happen in Figma, but how might you easily onboard teams onto the design system? And back to the story of the Wonder Women and the shared space that we had. So I called them my Wonder Women because they were my heroes, and they still are. In fact, they're still raising me. They're not done, sorry. But there was sacrifice involved in the maintaining the space and creating the order from the chaos that I was introducing. And it wasn't until one of them sat me down and helped me understand the implications of my actions and how that influenced the space around me that I could really pause and reflect and try to be better. And though I didn't start to put my toys away right away, I'll be honest, week after week, one toy at a time, I learned to do this. And eventually, I'll just take one toy out at a time. I wouldn't spill the whole box on the floor because I also had to do the tidying up. And I understood how hard it was. So what I learned from that story, and if we think about what that means in the context of shared spaces, a design system, like any shared space, it starts where all shared spaces begin. And that's with the people. So think about your design system as starting with the people in your organization, not necessarily just with the tools and with its constituent parts. And as an individual contributor in a shared space, really think about your actions. And for the most part, do you find yourself creating chaos or order for others? And chaos isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes chaos helps shake up structures that no longer serve the people today, and they need to be reestablished in better ways to serve the needs of today. And that's okay. But then what are you doing after you create that chaos? How are you helping to create order for others to make sense of the shared space? And depending on the organization that you work for, you may have design system heroes. You may have some people that are working day after day in trying to build, establish, or develop a design system. It may be a centralized team. It may be a set of individuals. It may be one person. But generally speaking, we all know from watching many films and just life that the efforts of the whole always overpower the sacrifices of the few. So if you can empower everyone to be able to easily use the tools to build better product experiences, then in my view, we can all be heroes and no one needs to self-sacrifice. Thank you so much.